Tonight, we follow the trail of an empire that once spanned continents, yet somehow vanished from memory. Not conquered, not collapsed, but erased. A civilization known as Tartaria, hidden beneath centuries of silence and shadows cast by the Vatican itself. For generations, we have been taught a simple story. Rome fell, darkness followed, and only the church preserved the light. But scattered across old maps and forgotten architecture lies another truth, one too dangerous to be admitted. Cities that glowed with strange energy, towers that drew power from the sky, and knowledge that could have freed humanity from dependence. Why does Tartaria no longer appear in our history books? Why do its cathedrals look identical to churches rebranded as holy? And why does every path lead back to the Vatican, whose vaults guard manuscripts we are never allowed to see? This is not just about a missing empire. It is about control. Control of time, control of memory, and control of the future, by deciding which past we are allowed to inherit. So, before you dismiss this as just another bedtime story, ask yourself, if an entire empire could be erased, what else have we forgotten? Like the video, subscribe, because tonight we enter the silence of the Vatican, and inside that silence, the shadow of Tartaria still waits. A name once stretched across maps larger than any empire, Tartaria. A kingdom so vast it covered lands from the frozen edge of Siberia to the mountains of Central Asia. Yet today, when you search the history books, it is as if it never existed. How can a civilization drawn on maps for centuries vanish so completely from memory? And why does one of the most powerful institutions on Earth, the Vatican, remain silent about it? The story of Tartaria begins with curiosity. Old maps printed in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries clearly label regions of Asia as Great Tartary. These maps were not the work of amateurs. They came from respected European cartographers who charted the known world. For them, Tartaria was no myth. It was real enough to be inked in bold letters across continents. And yet, flip open a modern atlas or classroom textbook, and the word is gone. What happened to erase such a colossal empire from human memory? When we ask that question, we begin to see shadows stretching back toward the Vatican. For centuries, the Church acted as the guardian of history. Through monasteries, libraries, and schools, it decided what knowledge was worth preserving and what was better forgotten. The very idea that a rival civilization once held technology, architecture, or influence that rivaled or surpassed the Roman legacy would have been dangerous. Rome, after all, was portrayed as the eternal foundation of European civilization. Anything that challenged that myth had to be pushed into silence. Some researchers point to the 19th century as the moment when Tartaria disappeared officially. This was an age of empire building, of colonial powers drawing borders across the globe. At the same time, history was being standardized, textbooks written, and narratives fixed. The Vatican, already practiced in shaping timelines during the so-called Dark Ages, allowed Tartaria to fade from record without protest. Silence became its most powerful weapon. By not speaking, it let time do the work of erasing. Yet, traces remained. Enormous star forts scattered across Europe and Asia, built with mathematical precision, do not fit the story of primitive societies. Cathedrals and towers with domes, spires, and intricate designs appear across continents, often in regions where local populations had no tradition of such construction. These structures whisper of a forgotten hand. They speak of an empire that knew more than we are told. And once again, the Vatican's silence becomes deafening. The mystery grows when we consider why the Church would avoid even naming Tartaria. Was it because acknowledging it would shatter the story of Rome as the unbroken line of civilization? Or perhaps because within Tartaria lay technologies or knowledge that conflicted with religious doctrine? If entire cities once ran on free energy, if architecture captured forces from the air, then the authority of the Church as the sole keeper of truth would crumble. So we are left with a haunting paradox, A civilization drawn boldly on maps, remembered in whispers, embedded in strange architecture, yet officially treated as if it never existed. Tartaria is both everywhere and nowhere. And at the centre of that silence stands the Vatican, a power that has always known when to speak and when to let history dissolve into shadows. The question is not whether Tartaria was real. The question is why we were never meant to remember. If you were to hold an atlas from the 17th or 18th century in your hands, you would see something strange, something that no modern textbook ever taught you. Across the top of Asia, stretching through what we now call Siberia and Mongolia, the word Tartaria is written in bold letters: Great Tartary, Little Tartary, Independent Tartary. It was mapped again and again by respected cartographers from Europe. Not a mistake, not a rumour, but an acknowledged part of the known world. And yet, by the time the 19th century gave way to the modern age, Tartaria was gone from the maps, as if it had never existed. What could cause an entire landmass and its people to vanish not from the earth, but from memory? The soil did not swallow them, the mountains did not collapse, the rivers did not dry up. But somewhere between the ink of old maps and the pages of new ones, Tartaria was erased. Historians say it was a case of mistaken geography, a broad name used for scattered nomads with no real empire. But if it was just a misunderstanding, why did it take centuries to correct? Why did so many maps drawn by so many skilled men carry the same name? As Europe advanced into the 19th century, the rewriting of history became an industry. Empires were defining themselves. Nations were teaching children a standardized story, and maps were no longer just guides for travel. They became tools of power. Whoever drew the map also drew the truth. And somewhere in that process, Tartaria ceased to exist. What had been acknowledged across centuries turned into a blank space filled with new names, new borders, and a new narrative. The Vatican's silence on this disappearance is telling. For centuries, the Church had positioned itself as the guardian of knowledge, the preserver of ancient history. If Tartaria was a myth, surely it could have said so clearly, decisively, and ended all confusion. But no such declaration was ever made. Instead, the silence allowed Tartaria to dissolve gradually. Each new atlas printed without the name was another brick in the wall separating us from the past. And soon, even scholars stopped asking questions. But old maps do not lie easily. They remain as stubborn witnesses, sitting in archives and private collections, their faded ink whispering a story that does not match the official record. These maps show a world where Tartaria was real, a land recognized by explorers and geographers. Their survival forces us to ask the question few dare to raise. Was Tartaria truly a misunderstanding, or was it a deliberate erasure orchestrated by those who shaped the memory of the world? The sudden disappearance of Tartaria from atlases is not just a curiosity of geography. It is a reminder that history can be rewritten not with fire or swords, but with ink and silence. A civilization can be erased not by conquest, but by being left off the map. And when the Vatican, with its power over the narrative of Europe, remains quiet, that silence becomes the loudest clue of all. Tartaria was there. The maps prove it. The real mystery is why they wanted you to forget it ever was. Open a classroom textbook today, and you will see the story of Rome, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and the rise of the modern world. You will be told of kings and crusades, explorers and revolutions, inventions and empires. Yet in all those pages there is no mention of Tartaria. A name once spread across maps of Europe and Asia has been stripped away, leaving not even a footnote for curious minds. This silence is not an accident. It follows the same pattern that once branded 1,000 years of European history as the Dark Ages, reducing centuries of complexity to a single word meant to cover over the truth. When the Church controlled the writing of history in medieval times, it decided which events deserved to be remembered and which ones would fade into oblivion. The Vatican dictated that the period after Rome's collapse was an age of ignorance and superstition. By doing so, it kept the population from asking questions about lost knowledge or erased progress. Centuries later, that same pattern seems to repeat itself with Tartaria. By simply not mentioning it in textbooks, by refusing to give it even a line in the story, it becomes as if it never existed. And generations of children grow up believing the world has always been exactly as they were taught. The strange thing is that evidence of Tartaria lies everywhere for those who look. Ancient maps, architectural wonders, and scattered references in older works remain stubborn against the tide of silence. But without institutional recognition, these fragments lose weight. If the Vatican does not teach it, if universities do not include it, if textbooks do not print it, then Tartaria becomes a ghost, a shadow wandering between myth and reality. It exists only in the margins, while the official pages remain blank. Consider the power of this omission. A student who grows up never hearing the word Tartaria will not think to ask what it was. A teacher who follows the curriculum will never pause the lesson to bring it up. Scholars who depend on funding will hesitate to research what has been labelled irrelevant. In this way, silence spreads like a fog, not by argument, but by emptiness. History is not denied outright. It is simply not told. And in the absence of questions, silence hardens into truth. This is why the parallel with the Dark Ages matters. That period was not truly dark, but it was made to appear so in order to control the narrative of progress. By presenting themselves as the bringers of light after centuries of ignorance, the Church claimed power over the future. With Tartaria, the blank pages serve the same purpose. If an empire with advanced knowledge once existed and was erased, then the story of Europe as the sole heir of Rome collapses. If the Vatican and its allies could hide one empire, what else could they hide? The textbooks will not answer this. They prefer the safety of silence. But each blank page is not empty. It is a door waiting to be opened, and behind it may lie a story far more extraordinary than anything we were ever taught to believe. History is not only written with ink, sometimes it is rewritten with fire. During the 18th and 19th centuries, across Europe and Asia, there were countless wars, revolutions, and campaigns of empire building. Palaces burned, libraries were emptied, and archives were relocated or destroyed. In that wave of chaos, many believe the memory of Tartaria was not simply forgotten, but deliberately erased. It was a war not fought on battlefields alone, but against the very idea that Tartaria had ever existed. The pattern is unsettling. Entire cities were rebuilt after mysterious fires, many of them sweeping through capitals and trading centres that once carried traces of Tartarian architecture. Moscow's Great Fire of 1812, which consumed much of the city during Napoleon's invasion, left few ancient structures standing. San Francisco in 1893, Chicago in 1871, and London in the mid-1700s all suffered massive fires that erased large sections of old architecture. Historians call them accidents, natural disasters, or acts of war. Yet when you see how often these fires struck places with suspiciously grand stone buildings that did not fit the local timeline, you begin to wonder if there was more at stake. At the same time, archives across Europe were reorganized, and vast collections of manuscripts were either locked away or destroyed. It was during this period that the Vatican tightened access to its secret archives, where thousands of documents were stored under the claim of preservation. Conveniently, many records that might have linked Europe to Tartaria vanished from public view. The few that survived outside the church often ended up in private collections, inaccessible to ordinary researchers. It is as if the 18th and 19th centuries were designed not only to advance modern empires, but to wipe out any rival history. Even archaeology was shaped by this erasure. Excavations that uncovered strange artifacts, anomalous architecture, or advanced tools were dismissed as curiosities. Many were quietly removed, labelled unimportant, or shipped to museums where they were never displayed. At the same time, universities standardized their curricula, ensuring that new historians would learn a uniform story of Europe's rise from the ruins of Rome, with no room for lost empires. Once again, silence was more powerful than denial. By making Tartaria irrelevant, it was as good as destroyed. What makes this war against memory so chilling is that it does not look like war at all. There are no declarations, no banners, no armies marching under flags. Instead, there is only the slow and steady disappearance of records, artifacts, and stories. One generation grows up with fewer reminders, the next grows up with none, and soon a civilization that once spanned half the globe becomes a forgotten rumour. But the traces that remain do not lie. Star forts, massive stone complexes, and maps labelling Tartaria still exist, and their very survival suggests that the erasure was not natural, it was systematic. If this is true, then the fires, the reorganisations, and the silences of the 18th and 19th centuries were not accidents of history. They were the final blows in a quiet war, a war fought not to conquer land, but to conquer memory itself. And the Vatican, with its long reach into archives, schools, and empires, may have been the general no one ever saw. Walk through the heart of any old European city, and your eyes are drawn upward. Enormous cathedrals with towering spires pierce the sky, domes rise like celestial globes, and stone walls stretch so high they seem to defy the tools and knowledge of their time. These buildings are called masterpieces of Catholic architecture, symbols of faith carved in stone. Yet, when you study their form, their symmetry, and their uncanny resemblance to structures found across Asia and even parts of Siberia, you begin to sense that these may not be purely creations of the Church. Some whisper they are remnants of Tartaria, an older civilization whose genius was absorbed and rebranded as Catholic heritage. Consider the domes. In Rome, in Paris, in Istanbul, and in Moscow, domes dominate the skyline. They are said to symbolize heaven, but their design also mirrors resonant chambers, the kind of structures that could harness sound and energy. Across continents, in lands once labelled Tartaria, the same domes appear, often connected to strange towers with metallic tops, like receivers pulling something invisible from the sky. These are not coincidences. The patterns are too consistent. Why would cultures, separated by such vast distances, suddenly build in the same way, unless they were inheriting a shared tradition? The spires tell another story. Sharp, needle-like points rising higher than any nearby building, often capped with metal crosses or orbs. We are told they are meant to reach toward heaven, but they also resemble conductors, like lightning rods, designed long before Benjamin Franklin made his discovery in the 18th century. How could medieval builders, supposedly limited to superstition and simple tools, conceive such precise forms that mirror later electrical science? Unless, of course, they were following designs passed down from a civilization that already understood. Even the interiors hold mysteries. Cathedrals with vast vaulted ceilings amplify sound in ways that modern engineers still study. Whisper in one corner, and your voice carries across the room with perfect clarity. Organs fitted inside seem designed not just for music, but for resonating the entire structure like a massive instrument. Was this simply devotion to God, or was it technology disguised as worship, energy flowing through stone, glass, and air? The Catholic Church claims ownership of these marvels. It points to the Renaissance and the Baroque periods as the flowering of human creativity under faith. But what if these buildings were not new creations at all? What if they were older, inherited structures built by Tartarians and later claimed by the Church as its own? Renovations could erase inscriptions, icons could be replaced. Pagan or Tartarian symbols could be carved over with Christian imagery until no one remembered who built them first. This absorption of Tartarian architecture would serve the Vatican perfectly. It allowed the Church to present itself as the beacon of light, the source of art and science, while quietly burying the truth that another civilization had already mastered these techniques. Every time a pilgrim gazed at a towering spire or knelt beneath a glowing dome, they were told it was a gift of Catholic faith. But perhaps it was really the echo of Tartaria, hidden in plain sight, standing as cathedrals of power that once lit the world in ways we are no longer allowed to understand. There are moments in history when it feels as though the world pressed a reset button. Whole civilizations vanish, landscapes are reshaped, and memories are wiped clean. Some researchers believe Tartaria suffered just such a fate, a worldwide cataclysm so devastating that it erased nearly every trace of the empire in a single generation. They call it the Great Reset, not the one we hear about today in politics and economics, but a far older and darker event that changed the face of the earth. The evidence begins with the mud flood theory. Across Europe, Russia, and Asia, buildings stand with lower floors buried beneath layers of earth, as if the ground suddenly rose and swallowed them. Windows sit half submerged, doorways open into soil, and entire streets lie hidden beneath modern cities. Official historians explain it as changes in construction or centuries of gradual build-up. But when you see cities on different continents showing the same pattern at the same time, coincidence becomes harder to accept. What if a cataclysm covered Tartarian cities in mud, leaving only the tops of their buildings visible, which later generations claimed as their own? Alongside the mud floods, there are stories of massive fires, earthquakes, and sudden climate shifts in the 18th and 19th centuries. These events often destroyed entire districts, wiping out architecture that carried strange designs not easily explained by the local culture. The destruction was then followed by rapid rebuilding under new styles, often labelled as Renaissance or Baroque, giving the impression that those grand buildings were Catholic creations rather than remnants of something older. The timing suggests a deliberate narrative, one where the Vatican and allied powers stepped in to frame the disaster not as the death of an empire, but as the natural evolution of European civilization. This pattern of replacement becomes even clearer when you realise how quickly history books were rewritten after these cataclysms. By the late 19th century, Tartaria had been erased from maps and textbooks. In its place, new stories were told of emerging nations, noble monarchies, and divine guidance from the Church. The narrative did not just hide Tartaria. It painted a world where only Rome and its religious heirs carried the torch of civilization through chaos. The Great Reset gave the Vatican a perfect opportunity to position itself as the one enduring authority in a shattered world. Yet the ruins remain stubborn. Star forts, intricate domes, and strange towers scattered across continents stand as silent witnesses to a civilization that did not simply fade away, but was buried, drowned, or burned into oblivion. If Tartaria was erased by a cataclysm, the Vatican's role was not in causing it, but in seizing control of the story that followed. By stepping into the silence left behind, it became the voice of history itself, deciding what humanity would remember and what it would forget. The idea of a great reset before the Great Reset may sound impossible, but if you listen to the echoes of half-buried cities and study the blank pages of rewritten textbooks, you begin to wonder. Perhaps the world did not simply move forward, perhaps it began again, and the Vatican made sure that when the story restarted, only its version of history remained. When Rome collapsed in the year 476, the world was supposed to have entered chaos. The Western Empire fell, emperors vanished, and cities crumbled. Yet within the ruins, a new power rose and declared itself the true heir of Rome. It was not a kingdom, nor a general, but the Church. The Vatican crowned itself the child of Rome, the one institution that claimed to preserve the empire's greatness while guiding humanity through what it called an age of darkness. But this inheritance came at a cost. To establish itself as the sole successor, the Vatican had to bury every other civilization that challenged the story. By calling itself the heir of Rome, the Church gained legitimacy. It claimed to inherit the language of Latin, the symbols of empire, and even the authority once held by emperors. The Pope was not just a religious leader, he was presented as a spiritual Caesar, a bridge between heaven and earth, standing where Rome's emperors once stood. But if this image was to hold, then rivals like Tartaria had to vanish. A world where other civilizations had grand architecture, advanced knowledge, or global influence would have made the Vatican's claim look weak. So history was shaped to focus on Rome, then silence, then the Church. This narrative was taught not only in sermons, but also in schools and monasteries. Children learned that Rome had fallen, Europe had stumbled into ignorance, and the Church had carried the flame until the Renaissance reignited civilization. It is a neat story, easy to follow, but it leaves no space for empires like Tartaria. By controlling the memory of the past, the Vatican erased the possibility that another empire could stand alongside Rome or even surpass it. The children of Rome were taught that there was only one line of inheritance flowing directly from Caesar to the Church. Even the architecture echoed this claim. Roman columns, arches, and domes were repurposed into Christian churches. Temples were converted into cathedrals. Symbols of empire were baptized with crosses and saints. Over time, the line between what was Roman and what was Catholic blurred until people believed the two were one. Meanwhile, Tartarian buildings that did not fit this image were either destroyed, rebuilt, or rebranded as Catholic marvels. The inheritance of Rome became a tool of domination not just over faith but over memory. The erasure was subtle but devastating. By teaching the world that Rome and the Church were inseparable, the Vatican placed itself at the center of all history. It declared that civilizations outside this chain were primitive, irrelevant, or non-existent. Tartaria, once bold across maps, became invisible. Other cultures were cast as shadows. And all the while, the Church maintained the shining image of being the child of Rome, the one guardian of civilization through the storms of time. But beneath that image lies a deeper truth. Rome did not simply pass its torch to the Church. That torch was seized, reshaped, and used to blind the world to other lights that once burned brightly. And in that darkness, Tartaria was lost, not because it did not exist, but because it did not fit the story the Vatican needed the world to believe. When we look back at the centuries following the fall of Rome, one detail stands out above all others. The guardians of knowledge were no longer scholars roaming free, nor philosophers debating in open schools. They were monks inside stone monasteries, cloistered away from the world. With ink, parchment, and quiet hands, they decided what humanity would remember and what would be left to vanish. And it is within this silence that the story of Tartaria fades, for no independent Tartarian records remain. The monasteries were presented as sanctuaries of learning, safe havens where sacred texts were preserved against the chaos of the outside world. Yet preservation was never neutral. Every manuscript copied had to pass through the filter of doctrine. Texts that praised the Church, upheld its worldview, or aligned with its teachings, were carefully rewritten and stored. Works that contradicted or challenged authority were quietly set aside, burned, or rewritten beyond recognition. A manuscript that told of an empire like Tartaria, vast and independent of Rome, would have been too dangerous to survive. Consider the power of scarcity. In a world where literacy was rare and books were treasures, a single monastery could hold more influence than a city of people. If monks did not copy a text, it simply ceased to exist for future generations. If they chose to translate works only into ecclesiastical Latin, a language inaccessible to most, then the knowledge remained locked in a vault of words only clerics could open. And so even if Tartarian records once existed, they were vulnerable to the quietest of erasures. They did not need to be erased with fire, they only needed to be ignored. The absence of independent Tartarian manuscripts raises troubling questions. Empires leave behind records. They carve their history into stone. They inscribe their victories on tablets. They compose songs of kings and maps of conquests. Yet with Tartaria, there is nothing. No official chronicle, no preserved epic, no archive accessible to the public. Historians explain this by claiming Tartaria was never real, just a name for wandering tribes. But what if the truth is simpler and darker? What if the records did exist, but they passed into the hands of monasteries and never returned? The Vatican's role in this silence cannot be ignored. Monastic orders across Europe were connected to the Church, loyal to its mission and bound to its authority. Their task was not only to preserve knowledge, but to shape it into acceptable form. Over centuries, this shaping became indistinguishable from history itself. A book that mentioned Tartaria too often might be corrected. A scroll describing technology beyond accepted timelines might be hidden. By the time the printing press arrived in the 15th century, the silence was already centuries old, sealed tight by monks who had filled libraries with carefully approved words. Monks with empty hands does not mean they held nothing. It means they allowed nothing outside their control to survive. Their hands were empty of Tartarian chronicles, empty of maps that contradicted the official story, empty of voices that might remind us of a civilization too powerful to ignore. And so when we search today for Tartaria in the libraries of Europe, we find only silence. A silence crafted in ink, shaped by doctrine, and guarded by men who believed that sometimes the greatest power lies not in what you copy, but in what you choose to let disappear. In the 16th century, a man named Gerardus Mercator created maps that shaped how we still see the world today. His work was celebrated for its precision and artistry, yet buried within those same maps is a detail that modern history prefers to forget. Across the vast expanse of northern Asia, stretching into Siberia and beyond, one word appears again and again: Tartaria. Not as a vague label for scattered tribes, but as a defined empire, a region so large and so important that no serious cartographer of the age ignored it. Early explorers confirmed this with journals and sketches, describing cities, fortresses, and cultures far too organized to be dismissed as myths. Yet somehow, as the centuries passed, those names and boundaries disappeared. Later editions of the same maps erased Tartaria almost completely, leaving us to ask why. Mercator was not alone. Other cartographers of the Renaissance and Enlightenment also placed Tartaria prominently on their charts. From France to Holland, maps circulated showing Great Tartary, Little Tartary, Independent Tartary, each with borders and regions that rivaled the size of Russia or China. These were not mistakes. Cartographers depended on accuracy to maintain their reputations. If Tartaria did not exist, why would so many maps repeat its presence with such detail? Explorers returning from Asia spoke of vast steppes, fortified cities, and rulers whose power stretched across continents. The name Tartaria was common knowledge, as real to them as Spain, France, or England. Yet by the 18th and 19th centuries, something changed. New atlases, printed in Europe, shrank Tartaria, splitting its lands into Russia, Mongolia, and China. Later still, the name vanished altogether. Schoolbooks no longer taught of it. Travellers no longer returned with tales of it. The word itself became a ghost, remembered only on yellowed maps stored in private collections or museums. The erasure was so complete that by the 20th century, Tartaria was dismissed as nothing more than a mistake of old cartography. But mistakes do not last for centuries across dozens of maps. Mistakes do not describe entire regions in consistent detail. Mistakes do not vanish only when new powers rise to claim those lands. The Vatican's silence during this transition is telling. At the very moment when Tartaria was being erased from atlases, the Church still controlled massive archives, libraries, and networks of scholars. If Tartaria had been a myth, it would have been easy to clarify. Instead, silence prevailed, and the maps that should not exist were quietly replaced with maps that told a more convenient story. A world where Rome's successor, the Church, remained central and no rival civilization complicated the narrative. The survival of Mercator's maps, and others like them, raises an uncomfortable question. Were these cartographers recording a real empire that later had to be erased? Or were they part of a deeper pattern, where history itself was redrawn, not only by lines on paper, but by the silence that followed? When you look at the maps that shouldn't exist, you are not just seeing ink on parchment. You are glimpsing a world that once was, a world too inconvenient for modern history to remember, and perhaps too dangerous for the Vatican to ever acknowledge. Beneath the streets of Vatican City lies a labyrinth of shelves and vaults stretching for miles, a place whispered about by scholars and conspiracy theorists alike. The Vatican's secret archives, as they are called, are not a myth. They are real, and they hold more than 12 centuries of manuscripts, letters, maps, and records. But the public has never been allowed to see even a fraction of what is inside. Only carefully chosen researchers may enter, and even they are restricted to requesting specific documents under heavy supervision. No photographs, no free browsing, no open shelves. In such a place of silence and control, it is not hard to imagine that the missing pieces of Tartaria may still exist, sealed behind stone and steel, hidden in plain sight. The Vatican has always presented itself as the guardian of knowledge. It claims that the archives are private, not secret, a place where fragile documents are preserved, rather than exposed to the chaos of the outside world. Yet the question remains, what is being preserved, and for whose eyes? If Tartaria truly stretched across Asia and into Europe, if its rulers, engineers, and explorers left behind records of their existence, those manuscripts had to go somewhere. They did not simply vanish into dust, they would have been collected, confiscated, or hidden. And the one institution with both the reach and the motive to do so has always been the Vatican. Rumours from scholars who were granted limited access tell of maps that do not match official history, letters that describe lands no longer on modern atlases, and manuscripts written in languages not yet deciphered. Could some of these belong to Tartaria? It would explain why the Vatican guards them so closely. To acknowledge Tartarian manuscripts would mean rewriting the accepted story of human civilization. It would mean admitting that Europe was not the only centre of knowledge after Rome. It would mean exposing that the so-called Dark Ages were not as dark as we have been told. Artifacts too may lie in these vaults. Strange tools, fragments of architecture, or energy devices that resemble nothing from the medieval world. Objects labelled heretical or unfit for public understanding could easily be hidden under the guise of protection. For centuries, the Vatican has had agents, scholars, and monastic orders travelling across the world collecting relics. To believe they ignored Tartarian remains would be naive. More likely, they took them, quietly filed them away, and locked them in the silent vault where no one would ever ask questions. The greatest trick of the archive is not in what it contains, but in how it hides. By labelling the collection private, the Vatican avoids accusations of secrecy. By granting access to a handful of approved scholars, it creates the illusion of transparency. Yet for the rest of the world, the vault remains closed. And within that silence, Tartaria may still exist, not as ruins on the surface, but as words on fragile parchment, sealed in the one place where history is preserved not to be shared, but to be controlled. Imagine walking through a city in the 18th century, where the streets glowed at night, not with candles or torches, but with a steady light that seemed to come from nowhere. Imagine domes and spires, not only serving as symbols of beauty, but acting as receivers, pulling invisible energy from the sky. This is the world some claim Tartaria once built, a civilization that tapped into atmospheric electricity, a form of free energy that could power entire cities without coal, oil, or wires. If true, it would mean that humanity once lived in a world that glowed, only to have that knowledge stripped away and buried in silence. Evidence of this lost technology is scattered across architecture that still stands today. Strange metallic ornaments, top spires and domes, often shaped like spheres, crosses, or needles. They are explained as decoration or lightning rods, but many appear centuries before Benjamin Franklin ever experimented with electricity. Cathedrals and government buildings from Europe to Asia share this feature, as if they were once part of a global network designed not for religion alone, but for harnessing energy from the atmosphere. Beneath them, intricate basements and vaulted chambers suggest distribution systems, places where energy could be stored, transformed, or redirected. Then there are the World's Fairs of the 19th century. Photographs show entire cities of gleaming towers, domes, and ornate structures lit brilliantly at night. Official history says they were powered by primitive generators built just in time for the exhibitions, then torn down and forgotten. Yet the designs of those temporary palaces resemble the same Tartarian style of architecture, filled with domes and towers that look suspiciously like energy receivers. Was this a brief glimpse of technology inherited from Tartaria, repackaged as modern invention before being hidden again? If Tartaria truly possessed free energy, its disappearance raises even more troubling questions. Who had the motive to suppress it? A civilization running on atmospheric electricity would not need coal barons, oil tycoons, or vast industries built on fuel extraction. It would not need the church to regulate knowledge or governments to control resources. Power, in every sense of the word, would belong to the people. By removing this technology from history, those who followed ensured a future where energy could be monopolized, sold, and used to maintain control. The Vatican's role in this silence cannot be dismissed. As guardian of manuscripts and knowledge, it would have had access to any records describing Tartarian technology. By branding such ideas heretical or dangerous, it ensured that humanity forgot a world where light was free. Instead, progress was carefully rationed. Electricity was discovered only in the 18th century, patented and controlled in the 19th, and distributed through wires and bills in the 20th. The memory of free energy was erased, replaced with a story of slow, steady invention that kept power in the hands of a few. A world that glowed may sound like fantasy, but the traces remain etched in stone and metal, in spires that still point to the heavens, and in ruins that whisper of a forgotten science. Perhaps Tartaria did not fall into darkness. Perhaps it was the light itself that was stolen, leaving us to live in a world far dimmer than the one our ancestors once knew. Walk through the old quarters of cities across Europe, Russia, or even the Americas, and you may notice something strange. Many of the grandest buildings sit half buried, their lower windows covered by soil, their doors sunken below street level, as if the ground rose overnight. Historians explain this as centuries of sediment buildup or changes in road levels, but others call it evidence of a global mud flood, a cataclysm that buried an older civilization. And within those half-buried structures may lie the remains of a power grid unlike anything we are taught about. The architecture tells a story no textbook dares to mention. Buildings from the 17th and 18th centuries show layers of design that do not match the tools or knowledge of their supposed builders. Massive stone blocks cut with precision, arches balanced with flawless symmetry, and windows shaped to amplify resonance. When you descend into the hidden lower levels, you find vaulted chambers and strange patterns carved into the walls, as if these spaces were not basements at all, but part of a system designed to channel energy. If Tartaria once tapped into atmospheric electricity, these submerged floors may have been the conduits of that power grid. Then there are the star forts, scattered across the world in astonishing numbers. From Italy to India, from Russia to North America, they appear with the same geometric precision, massive star-shaped bastions carved into the landscape. Military historians insist they were defensive forts, designed to repel cannon fire. Yet the scale and complexity of many seem unnecessary for simple defense. Their shapes mirror resonant circuits, patterns that today's engineers recognize as efficient for channeling and dispersing energy. Was their true purpose not war, but power? Were they nodes in a vast grid, linked together across continents to stabilize the energy flowing from Tartarian towers and domes? The towers themselves raise even more questions. Thin, tall structures capped with metallic ornaments appear in old illustrations and photographs, often standing alone or connected to grand buildings. Officially, they are bell towers, watchtowers, or decorative spires, but many are hollow, with chambers inside that seem designed for more than bells. Their resemblance to modern radio towers and Tesla coils is uncanny. In some cases, wires were even photographed running from them during the 19th century, long before electricity was supposedly widespread. Could these towers have once drawn energy from the atmosphere and distributed it to the cities below? If we accept this possibility, then the erasure of Tartaria takes on a new light. By rebranding these structures as forts, churches, or simple architecture, the Vatican and allied powers removed the memory of a civilization that had mastered free energy. The mud flood may have buried the physical evidence, but the redefinition of their purpose buried the truth even deeper. Today, we pass by these relics without a second glance. Tour guides call them defences, architects call them styles, and textbooks call them curiosities. Yet, when you step back and connect the patterns, the picture becomes clearer. These are not random ruins. They are relics of a lost power grid, fragments of a world where energy flowed freely, hidden under soil and silence, waiting for us to remember what we were never meant to know. When an empire disappears from the record, it rarely happens by accident. It takes more than silence to erase a civilization as vast as Tartaria. It takes cooperation. And strangely enough, the erasure of Tartaria seems to have been carried out not by one power alone, but by two. On one side stood the Vatican, eager to protect its story of being the sole inheritor of Rome. On the other stood the Russian Empire, rising in the east and hungry to claim vast lands as its own. Together, Rome and Moscow formed an axis of revision, rewriting history in parallel but for very different reasons. For the Vatican, the motive was clear. Tartaria represented a rival narrative that threatened the Church's claim as the guardian of civilization. If Tartaria had cities with advanced architecture, energy systems, and knowledge independent of Rome, then the idea that the Church carried Europe through the so-called Dark Ages would collapse. By ensuring that Tartaria vanished from maps, manuscripts, and classrooms, the Vatican tightened its grip on the past. The Church did not need to deny Tartaria loudly. It only needed to remain silent until generations forgot the name. For the Russian Empire, the reasons were more territorial. As Russia expanded eastward in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, it absorbed lands that had once been labelled as Tartaria. Siberia, Central Asia, and parts of the Caucasus all fell under Russian control. To legitimize this conquest, history had to be rewritten. Instead of acknowledging a fallen empire, Russia described these lands as wilderness inhabited by nomads. Tartaria became a label for barbarians, not a memory of kings. By erasing the idea of an organized civilization, Russia could claim to be the first true power to tame the steppes. The parallels are striking. At the same time that European atlases stopped printing Tartaria, Russian maps began replacing it with their own imperial provinces. At the same time that Catholic schools dismissed Tartaria as a myth, Russian academies taught that the empire had never existed. Two great powers, often seen as rivals, were united in silence. The Vatican buried Tartaria to protect its spiritual monopoly. Russia buried Tartaria to justify its territorial empire. The result was the same. A vast civilization disappeared from human memory. This Rome-Moscow axis is rarely acknowledged, but its fingerprints remain. Old maps showing Tartaria can be found in both European and Russian archives, yet neither side promotes them. Ancient buildings across Siberia are attributed to peasants with simple tools, while star forts in Europe are labelled as military designs. The story is consistent because both narratives were crafted to align. The Vatican needed Tartaria gone to preserve its myth of continuity. Russia needed Tartaria gone to claim the land without challenge. And so Tartaria was erased not by war or fire alone, but by a quiet pact of convenience. Two powers, two motives, one outcome. The greatest empire that once stretched across half the world was reduced to a forgotten name on fading maps. When Rome and Moscow rewrote history, they did not just redraw borders. They reshaped the memory of humanity, leaving us to inherit a past carefully edited to serve their future. Wars are remembered as battles between nations, kings, and generals. They are told as stories of courage and conquest, drawn in blood and fire across the pages of history. But what if some wars were not fought for territory alone? What if their true purpose was to erase the remains of a civilization that no longer fit the official timeline? When you look closely at conflicts like the Napoleonic Wars and the Crimean War, the destruction often seems less about enemies clashing and more about cities and structures being wiped from the map. These may not have been ordinary wars at all, but phantom wars designed to remove Tartarian infrastructure from the landscape. Take Napoleon's invasion of Russia in the early 19th century. Official history tells of the French army marching deep into Russian territory, only to be undone by the brutal winter. Yet, when Moscow was abandoned, it was not simply deserted. A massive fire consumed most of the city, leaving little behind of its older structures. Strangely, many of the grandest stone buildings survived partially buried or scarred, as if they had belonged to an older style that did not match the new empire rising from the ashes. Was the fire an accident of war, or was it a convenient way to erase Tartarian architecture and rebuild Moscow as a Russian and European capital, free of inconvenient reminders? The Crimean War in the mid-19th century raises similar questions. Britain, France, and the Ottoman Empire allied against Russia in what is officially remembered as a struggle over territory and influence. Yet the war focused heavily on the destruction of fortresses and ports along the Black Sea, many of which resembled star forts and advanced defensive structures that historians struggle to explain. Were these really Russian forts, or remnants of Tartarian design rebranded by whoever controlled them? If they were older than the war itself, then the bombardments and sieges may have been less about defeating enemies and more about demolishing structures that revealed too much. Even in Western Europe, wars often left suspiciously similar scars. Fires in Paris, London, and Vienna during times of conflict destroyed entire districts that contained strange domes, towers, and underground chambers. Rebuilding efforts that followed quickly replaced them with architecture labelled as Gothic Revival or Neoclassical, erasing any chance of questioning who had built the originals. If Tartaria truly existed, then these wars served as a cover for controlled demolition on a global scale, wiping the power grid of a lost civilization while telling the public it was just the chaos of battle. The most unsettling part of this theory is how effective it has been. When we think of these wars today, we imagine heroic soldiers and decisive battles. We rarely ask why so many ancient structures disappeared at the same time. We never question why maps changed so drastically after the smoke cleared, and we almost never consider that the Vatican and empires alike may have used these conflicts not just to redraw borders, but to bury the ruins of Tartaria under the ashes of war. Phantom wars leave behind monuments and memorials, but their real victory may be in what they made us forget. History often celebrates saints as holy figures who brought light to dark times, credited with miracles, wisdom, and divine inspiration. Their stories fill church records, paintings, and textbooks, shaping the way generations understand the past. But when you peel back the layers, a strange pattern emerges. Many saints are remembered not for their piety alone, but for their supposed inventions, their architectural feats, or their strange knowledge of science and technology. What if some of these saints were not the originators of these wonders at all, but placeholders, names invented to cover up the true engineers and inventors of Tartarian origin. Consider the stories of medieval cathedrals and miraculous constructions. Legends claim saints or holy men designed soaring domes, lifted impossible stones, or built entire sanctuaries overnight. People were told that angels or divine visions guided the process, erasing any question of human ingenuity. Yet, when you look at these structures, they align with the same architectural language found across the ruins of Tartaria, with domes, spires, and resonant chambers that seem more like technology than miracle. It is far more likely that the builders were engineers from a forgotten civilization, their names erased and replaced by saints whose stories fit the Vatican's narrative. The same applies to discoveries in medicine and science. Throughout the Middle Ages, certain saints were credited with cures, medical knowledge, or natural philosophies that appeared suddenly and without clear origin. These stories rarely explain how such knowledge survived the supposed Dark Ages. Instead, they wrap the discoveries in tales of faith and divine revelation. What if those cures and sciences were fragments of Tartarian knowledge, preserved through artifacts and manuscripts, then rebranded as miracles of the Church? By attributing them to saints, the Vatican could claim ownership of innovation without admitting that it came from a rival civilization. Even inventions we take for granted today carry this shadow. Water systems, astronomical instruments, and mechanical devices sometimes appear in the record centuries before they were supposedly reinvented in Europe. Instead of acknowledging continuity from Tartaria, history inserts figures like saints or obscure monks who are suddenly credited with genius. Their names often lack independent confirmation outside of church archives, raising the question of whether they ever existed at all. They may have been narrative tools, created to ensure the public believed knowledge flowed only through the church. This substitution of saints for scholars served a powerful purpose. It created the illusion that all progress came from faith, not from independent civilizations. It ensured that people looked to the Vatican as the sole guardian of truth and miracles, while the real inventors were left to vanish in silence. Over centuries, these substitutions hardened into tradition, making it nearly impossible to separate fact from fiction. The saints and the scholars may not have been the same people, but their stories became inseparable. Behind the glowing halos and sacred legends may lie the shadows of Tartarian engineers, whose brilliance was too threatening to survive in its true form. By transforming inventors into saints, the Vatican preserved the works but erased the names, ensuring that history remembered miracles instead of machines, faith instead of knowledge, and saints instead of the civilization that once created a world far more advanced than we are taught to believe. Walk through the oldest parts of European cities, and you will notice something peculiar. Grand stone buildings stand with their windows half buried, their doors sunk below the ground, their basements looking more like the first floor of a house. The same pattern appears in Russia, in America, even in Asia. Buildings that should be tall and open are instead swallowed by earth, as if the ground itself rose up and consumed them. This is the foundation of the mud flood theory, the idea that a worldwide cataclysm buried entire cities of a forgotten civilization. And if that civilization was Tartaria, then the Vatican's role becomes clear, not in causing the event, but in shaping the story that came after. The mud flood is not recorded in textbooks. Historians explain the buried windows and hidden streets as changes in road levels, centuries of debris piling up, or poor planning by builders. Yet the scale of the phenomenon suggests something more. In places thousands of miles apart, we find the same strange evidence. Cathedrals with sunken entrances, government buildings with underground arches, and entire neighborhoods hidden below the surface. Some cities even reveal multiple layers when excavated, as though entire streets were drowned and then built over. Was this really poor planning repeated across continents, or was it the aftermath of a single event that changed the face of the world? Theories about the cause of the mud flood vary. Some suggest massive earthquakes, others a shift in the Earth's crust, or even atmospheric events that brought waves of mud and water across the land. Whatever the mechanism, the effect was the same. Tartarian cities were buried, their technology and infrastructure hidden beneath layers of soil, leaving only the tops of buildings visible. Later generations would claim these survivors as their own, rebuilding on top of what remained and rewriting the story of who built them. And here is where the Vatican stepped in. The Church had the unique position of controlling manuscripts, maps, and education across Europe. When people asked why their cities seemed buried, why cathedrals stood with doors leading into dirt, the answers came not from science, but from priests and scholars loyal to the Vatican. They called it natural change. They explained it away as centuries of time, and in doing so, they erased the memory of a disaster that may have reshaped civilization. By controlling the explanation, they ensured no one would connect the buried structures to Tartaria. The mud flood mystery remains one of the most haunting gaps in history. The physical evidence lies beneath our feet, in basements that were never basements, in windows that should open to the air but stare into earth. Yet the official story does not allow for a forgotten civilization lost to a cataclysm. Instead, we are told to accept accidents, coincidences, and gradual decay. Perhaps the truth is simpler. A great disaster wiped away Tartaria, and the Vatican, standing ready in the silence that followed, rewrote the world in its own image. The mud buried the cities, but it was the Church that buried the memory. Walk into an ancient cathedral and you will be surrounded by a flood of imagery. Saints with halos glowing like suns, angels with wings outstretched, strange patterns carved into stone and glass that repeat like codes. To the faithful, these are symbols of Christianity, reminders of heaven and holy stories. But when you compare them to older motifs scattered across Asia, Siberia, and forgotten ruins, they begin to look less like Christian art and more like something older. Perhaps they are the remnants of Tartarian symbolism, rebranded and reshaped to fit the Vatican's narrative, hidden in plain sight as icons and idols. One of the most striking details is the halo. In Christian art, halos represent divine light, the presence of God radiating around holy figures. Yet halos appear in far older traditions across Eurasia, often as solar disks, cosmic orbs, or energy fields drawn around rulers and deities. Tartarian culture, if it existed as widely as the maps suggest, may have used the halo to represent energy, power, or knowledge. When the Vatican absorbed the art, the symbol was not erased but repurposed, changing its meaning from natural or technological power to divine blessing. The image remained, but its story was rewritten. Then there are the strange geometric patterns woven into church art and architecture. Spirals, interlocking circles, and star shapes appear in mosaics, stained glass, and floor tiles. To the casual eye, they are decorative flourishes. But many of these shapes align with ancient diagrams of resonance, energy flow, and astronomy. Could they have been Tartarian symbols, encoding knowledge of sound, light, and geometry? If so, then Christian art did not create them but disguised them, turning functional symbols into sacred designs. The faithful would see faith, while the initiated might remember something deeper. Even the idols of saints themselves raise questions. Stories abound of saints credited with miracles of healing, invention, or sudden bursts of knowledge. Statues show them holding strange objects, globes, staffs, or devices that seem out of place for their era. Were these holy relics, or depictions of tools once used by Tartarian engineers and thinkers? If Tartaria had advanced technology, its symbols would have survived in its art. By recasting them as religious relics, the Vatican preserved the images but erased their origins, ensuring that no one asked questions about machines hidden in the hands of saints. This transformation of art served a powerful purpose. People could still admire the beauty of Tartarian symbols, but they no longer understood them. A star that once represented energy became the Star of Bethlehem. A spiral that once mapped resonance became a decorative border. A radiant disk that once encoded solar knowledge became a halo. Knowledge was not destroyed, but it was masked beneath layers of Christian imagery, turned into devotion instead of discovery. Icons and idols still surround us, glowing from church walls and museum galleries. To most, they are only sacred art. But to those who look closer, they may be the last surviving fragments of Tartaria's lost symbolism, hidden in plain sight by the very institution that worked hardest to erase the empire from memory. The Vatican did not need to destroy the art. It only needed to baptize it, transforming knowledge into faith and leaving us to wonder what truths still hide beneath the paint and stone. Legends whisper of a civilization where light filled the streets without fire, where music could heal the body, and where ships floated not only on water but in the sky. These are not fairy tales from distant lands, but fragments of memory tied to Tartaria. Stories of free energy flowing through towers and domes, of acoustics so advanced that sound itself became a tool, of airships drifting above cities long before the invention of balloons or airplanes. Yet, when you open a Vatican-approved history book, there is nothing, no mention, no discussion, not even ridicule. The silence is louder than denial, raising the question of why such inventions exist in legend but not in the official record. Free energy is the most haunting of these claims. Across old architecture, domes and spires, capped with metallic shapes, resemble devices designed to collect atmospheric electricity. Some researchers suggest entire cities once glowed with power, pulled directly from the air. If this were true, it would mean that Tartaria mastered a technology modern society still struggles to perfect. But why does history pretend it never existed? Perhaps because free energy threatens the very foundations of control. If energy is free, no empire, no church, and no company can monopolize it. By burying Tartaria, those who followed ensured the world would grow dependent on systems they could control and profit from. Then there are the tales of acoustics, whispered in monasteries and preserved in strange ruins. Massive halls that amplify whispers into roars, instruments that resonate with stone itself, and sound patterns that seem capable of moving objects or altering states of mind. Ancient texts describe music that heals, tones that lift, and frequencies that unlock hidden power. Science today studies vibration and resonance, but Tartaria may have already understood these principles centuries ago. By silencing this knowledge, the Vatican kept a tool of power out of human hands, branding it heretical or mystical whenever fragments resurfaced. And what of the airships? Old engravings and paintings from the 17th and 18th centuries show floating vessels in the sky, not shaped like modern airplanes, but resembling grand ships carried aloft by unknown forces. Some dismiss these as artistic fantasies, yet their presence across cultures suggests otherwise. If Tartaria once built machines capable of flight, their existence would rewrite the timeline of human invention entirely. The Vatican-approved version insists flight was not achieved until the 20th century, but the legends suggest humanity may have soared centuries earlier under a forgotten banner. The silence around these inventions is deliberate. By erasing Tartaria, the Vatican and its allies erased the possibility of a world where technology was not tied to control. Instead, they replaced it with a slow march of invention, where each discovery was rationed, patented, and placed under authority. Humanity was told it crawled from darkness into light, never suspecting the light had once been brighter, freer, and shared by all. Forbidden technology is not forbidden because it is false. It is forbidden because it is too liberating. The legends of Tartaria may not be myths at all. They may be memories of a world the Vatican needed us to forget. A world where the impossible was once simply life, and where the future we dream of today had already been lived and lost. Deep beneath the walls of Vatican City lies a vault so heavily guarded that only a handful of scholars ever glimpse its treasures. The Vatican's secret archives stretch for miles, filled with manuscripts, letters, and maps collected over centuries. In Russia, far from Rome, another vast archive lies hidden in the imperial collections, a library of state documents stretching back through the Tsars. At first glance, these two repositories could not be more different. One serves the spiritual empire of the Church, the other the political empire of the Tsars. Yet when it comes to Tartaria, they share a chilling similarity. Both hold missing fragments of its history, and both keep those fragments sealed from public view. The Vatican's motive for silence is clear. As the self-proclaimed guardian of Roman legacy, the Church could not allow evidence of a rival empire that rivaled or surpassed its knowledge. Tartarian manuscripts, maps, or artifacts would shatter the carefully crafted timeline that places Rome and the Church at the center of human progress. By locking away any trace of Tartaria, the Vatican ensured that the faithful and even scholars would never question its version of history. Those who ask what lies within the archives are told it is preservation, not secrecy, but the effect is the same. Tartaria exists only as a ghost, perhaps resting on dusty shelves where no eyes may see. Russia's role is more complicated. As the Russian Empire expanded eastward in the 17th and 18th centuries, it swallowed lands once labelled as Tartaria. With conquest came control of records, chronicles, and artifacts that told the story of the people who lived there. Instead of preserving those histories openly, the Tsars and their scholars absorbed them into state archives, rewriting the story so that Tartaria appeared as nothing more than nomadic tribes. To admit the existence of a powerful empire would have undermined Russia's claim as the rightful ruler of the steppes, so the archives were sealed, the documents reinterpreted, and the name of Tartaria quietly erased. What makes this tale of two archives so striking is how both sides, enemies in politics and faith, acted in parallel. Rome buried Tartaria to protect its myth of continuity from Caesar to the Pope. Moscow buried Tartaria to legitimize its empire and erase rivals from its conquered land. The motives differed, but the outcome was the same. Tartaria vanished not only from maps, but from memory. With the key evidence locked away in libraries, the public will never freely enter. Even today, glimpses of these archives fuel suspicion. Rumours speak of maps in the Vatican showing Tartaria in full detail, of manuscripts in Russian vaults describing technologies far beyond their time. Yet access remains tightly restricted. Scholars may request documents, but only those already approved. Anything that contradicts official history never leaves the shelves. The story of Tartaria is not lost because no one wrote it. It is lost because two of the most powerful archives in the world refuse to let us read it. A tale of two archives is a tale of silence, where church and empire together chose to guard the same secret. And until their vaults are opened, Tartaria remains a forbidden chapter of human history, trapped between Rome's silence and Moscow's ambition. In the 16th century, a new order of the Catholic Church was formed, one that would soon spread across the globe with unmatched zeal. They were the Jesuits, soldiers of faith, armed not with swords, but with education, persuasion, and secrecy. Their mission was to bring the world under the guidance of Rome, yet in doing so, they also became some of the most skilled information gatherers in history. When we trace their journeys into Asia and Siberia, we find a strange possibility. Were the Jesuits not only spreading religion, but also collecting knowledge about Tartaria, acting as agents to suppress its memory and deliver its secrets into Vatican hands? The Jesuits were masters of infiltration. Unlike other missionaries who demanded conversion at once, they learned local languages, studied traditions, and inserted themselves into the courts of kings and emperors. In China, they became advisors on astronomy and engineering. In Japan, they taught mathematics and navigation. And in Siberia, they moved quietly among tribes and towns. On the surface, this was cultural exchange. Beneath it, they were gathering intelligence, charting maps, and recording details of civilizations far beyond Europe. If Tartaria existed, it is almost impossible the Jesuits did not encounter it. Accounts from Jesuit letters often describe lands that later vanish from the official record. They speak of vast territories with organized rulers, grand cities, and technologies that seemed out of place for the supposed level of development. Many of these reports were sent directly back to Rome, where they disappeared into the Vatican archives. What the world received instead were carefully curated stories that emphasized pagan ignorance, spiritual darkness, and the need for Catholic guidance. If Tartaria appeared in their notes as a thriving empire, that truth never reached the public. Siberia, in particular, raises questions. As Russia expanded eastward in the 17th century, Jesuits were often present. They offered counsel to explorers, guided conversions of local populations, and acted as intermediaries between European powers. Could they also have been identifying Tartarian strongholds, cataloguing architecture, and marking sites that would later be erased or rebuilt? Their presence at the frontier of empire meant they were always in position to gather what needed to be hidden. The connection between Jesuits and suppression grows stronger when we consider their reputation for secrecy. The order was structured like a military unit, with strict obedience and coded communication. Reports were not shared freely, but funneled upward through ranks, ultimately to the Pope. This ensured that sensitive information, such as evidence of Tartaria, could be filtered and locked away without ever reaching scholars outside the Church. By the time history books were written, the Jesuit influence ensured Tartaria's name had already been replaced by narratives of nomads and wilderness. The Jesuits presented themselves as servants of God, but they also served as the Vatican's eyes and ears. Their missions doubled as reconnaissance, their sermons as cover for data collection. If Tartaria truly existed as the maps suggest, then the Jesuits likely saw it, recorded it, and helped erase it. The Jesuit connection may be the missing link between the physical ruins we still see and the silence that surrounds them. A brotherhood of missionaries turned archivists, delivering not salvation but secrecy, ensuring that the story of Tartaria would never be told outside the vaults of Rome. Walk through Paris, Moscow, Vienna, or even cities in North America, and you will find the same towering domes, sweeping arches, and ornate facades staring back at you. Historians call them Renaissance or Baroque masterpieces, products of brilliant architects funded by kings and popes. Yet when you compare them across continents, the similarities are too precise, too global, to be dismissed as coincidence. How could architects separated by thousands of miles, with no shared communication networks, produce buildings that look as though they came from the same blueprint? The answer may be that they did not create them at all. These shadows in stone could be the surviving footprint of Tartaria, a civilization whose architecture was absorbed into later styles and rebranded as the glory of Europe. The domes are the most obvious clue. St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and the Kremlin's cathedrals in Moscow all share the same massive spherical crowns, capped with spires or crosses. Official history insists these were local developments, born of religious fervour and artistic genius. But then you see similar domes rising in India, in Central Asia, and even in early American state buildings. How could the same design language stretch across the world before global travel and communication were common? Unless, of course, they were remnants of a civilization that once built on a scale far beyond our imagination. Government buildings raise the same question. From Washington, D.C. to St. Petersburg, we see the same neoclassical facades, endless columns, and vast symmetrical layouts. Historians argue these were deliberate imitations of Rome and Greece, symbols of authority borrowed by new nations. But the scale and precision suggest more than imitation. Many of these structures appear to have been inherited, not constructed from scratch, with lower levels buried beneath modern streets and foundations far deeper than 19th century construction should allow. These hidden layers hint at older origins, possibly Tartarian, later claimed by rising governments eager to present them as their own creations. Even the decorative details whisper of a lost hand. Intricate carvings, geometric patterns, and perfect alignments with astronomical markers appear in buildings from Prague to Mexico City. Some feature motifs resembling energy flow, spirals and circles that suggest more than decoration. Were these functional designs disguised as ornament, part of a global architectural system now forgotten? If so, then the so-called Renaissance and Baroque were less about rebirth and more about rebranding, a repainting of inherited Tartarian structures into the language of Catholicism and empire. The Vatican's role in this transformation is impossible to ignore. By labeling these buildings as the flowering of Christian civilization, it claimed ownership over a legacy that may not have been its own. Meanwhile, Russian rulers pointed to the same architecture as proof of their imperial destiny. Across continents, different powers used the same structures to tell different stories, all while burying the possibility that they belonged to Tartaria. The shadows in stone remain long after the names have been erased. Cathedrals, palaces, and government halls still stand as monuments, not just to the nations that claim them, but to a forgotten civilization that left its mark on the world. We are told they are Renaissance or Baroque, but when the same style repeats across continents with uncanny precision, the question becomes unavoidable. Are we walking through the legacy of Europe, or are we wandering through the surviving footprint of Tartaria, hidden in plain sight? In the 16th century, Pope Gregory XIII introduced a reform that forever changed the way humanity measures time. The Gregorian calendar replaced the old Julian system, shaving days from the year and resetting the rhythm of centuries. Officially, this was a correction, an adjustment to bring the dates of Easter back in line with the solar year. But some believe it was more than that. What if the reform also shifted entire timelines, burying the memory of civilizations like Tartaria by altering the very framework of history itself? When you control the calendar, you control how the past is remembered. The switch was dramatic. In October of 1582, entire days vanished. People went to bed on October 4th and woke up on October 15th, as if 10 days had been stolen overnight. At the time, most accepted this as a practical fix. Yet imagine what else can vanish when the keepers of history are the ones who decide what year it island. If days can be erased, so too can decades, even centuries. Some theories suggest that Tartaria's true timeline may have been shifted or absorbed, its rise and fall buried in the gaps created by calendar reform. The Vatican had every reason to manipulate chronology. By aligning history with its own story, it ensured that Rome and the Church remained the central axis of time. Events that did not fit this narrative could be pushed backward or forward, reclassified as myths or misplaced in forgotten centuries. The so-called phantom time hypothesis, which argues that entire centuries may have been fabricated or rearranged, fits uncomfortably well with the silence around Tartaria. If its empire existed during years later, erased or reassigned, then its disappearance from history would not require destruction alone. It would only require the careful rewriting of dates. Consider how dependent we are on calendars to shape our sense of history. We believe the Middle Ages lasted 1,000 years because the dates tell us so. We believe the Renaissance began in the 14th century because the calendar says it did. But what if those markers are artificial, designed to create the illusion of continuity from Rome to modern Europe? In that illusion, Tartaria finds no place. Its architecture, maps, and legends can be dismissed as belonging to another time, a time that no longer officially exists. The absence of Tartaria in history books is not just a matter of omission. It may also be a matter of chronology. If the Vatican deliberately restructured the calendar to suit its narrative, then it also restructured memory. Tartarian rulers and engineers could have been contemporaries of medieval kings, yet the dates place them elsewhere, lost in phantom centuries. Their cities could have thrived alongside Rome, but the timeline refuses to show it. By rewriting the calendar, the Vatican did more than correct time. it may have rewritten reality itself. A civilization can be erased not only by fire or flood, but by being placed outside of history, shifted onto a timeline that no longer exists. And if Tartaria fell victim to this manipulation, then its true story is not lost. It is hidden in the missing days, the stolen years, and the silence of a calendar that tells us only what the Vatican wanted us to believe. Why would anyone want to erase an entire empire from the memory of mankind? That is the question at the heart of Tartaria's disappearance. An empire that spanned continents, left behind colossal architecture, and possibly harnessed forms of energy modern science still struggles to explain, somehow vanished not only from maps, but from the collective mind. To understand why, we must look at those who benefited most from its erasure, and once again all roads lead back to the Vatican. Control of history has always been the ultimate weapon. If people believe the world was ignorant, broken, and helpless after the fall of Rome, then the Vatican appears as the saviour, the light in the darkness. But if Tartaria had remained in the narrative, the story would be different. Humanity would have known there was another great civilization, one not dependent on Rome or Christianity, thriving with knowledge and technology that could rival or surpass anything in the West. That revelation would have shattered the Church's monopoly on truth and stripped away its aura as the guardian of civilization. Technology is another reason. Legends speak of Tartarian energy systems, towers that drew power from the air, cities lit without coal or oil, an architecture designed not only for beauty but for function. If such knowledge were widely known, it would have made the Vatican's miracles seem small in comparison. The Church could not allow people to look at stone cathedrals and see Tartarian power stations instead of holy houses of God. Nor could it risk a society that no longer needed priests to mediate between man and divine energy, when entire cities might already have been powered by the natural forces of the earth and sky. There is also the question of loyalty. The Vatican built its influence by becoming the centre of salvation. To achieve this, humanity had to believe it was lost, weak, and in need of redemption. A proud memory of Tartaria, a civilization that stood on its own without Rome, would have inspired independence. People would have looked to their ancestors, not the pulpit, for guidance. Faith in institutions would have been replaced by faith in human ability, a dangerous shift for those who thrived on obedience. By erasing Tartaria, the Vatican ensured it alone remained the bridge between past and future. Every invention rediscovered in the Renaissance, every fragment of knowledge released in carefully timed doses, seemed to come from the hands of the Church. Meanwhile, any alternative source of wisdom was locked away in vaults, misattributed to saints, or buried under new calendars and rewritten timelines. So why hide an empire? Because an empire that proves humanity is capable of greatness without Rome or the Church is the most dangerous truth of all. Tartaria's memory would have broken the illusion of darkness and shown that light already existed, not as divine revelation, but as human creation. And for those who built their power on controlling memory, that was a threat too great to let survive. Time is not only the measure of days and years, it is the fabric of memory, the rhythm by which civilizations are remembered or forgotten. And when someone holds the keys to that fabric, they hold power greater than armies, greater than kings. They hold the ability to decide who existed and who never did, who rises in glory and who vanishes into myth. In this story of Tartaria, the lost empire erased from maps and memory, the Vatican emerges not simply as a church, but as the gatekeeper of time itself. Think about it. Tartaria does not only disappear through war or disaster, it disappears through silence. Maps that once marked its boundaries are redrawn. Manuscripts that spoke of its cities and inventions are hidden or destroyed. Architecture that stood as proof is rebranded as Roman, Gothic, or Baroque. And through each of these quiet steps, Tartaria slips away, not into dust, but into shadows where only a few dare to search. The hand that controls history books, that sets the calendar, that decides which stories are told in schools and which are whispered as conspiracy, is the hand that truly controls time. Perhaps Tartaria was never lost at all. Perhaps its records lie beneath the cold stones of the Vatican secret archives, sealed in shelves that no scholar can freely open. Perhaps its maps remain rolled and hidden, showing borders of a civilization that once stretched across continents. Perhaps its inventions, its knowledge of energy, architecture, and the earth itself, are still preserved, waiting for a day when humanity is ready to see without fear. If so, then the silence is not an accident. It is a decision, a strategy designed to keep the world looking to one authority for salvation, while ignoring the proof that we once held it within ourselves. And yet, no silence lasts forever. Cracks appear in the narrative. Old maps resurface. Strange buildings reveal secrets in their design. Legends refuse to die, whispered from one generation to the next. Even the stars, unbending in their cosmic truth, raise questions when timelines fail to align. Every unanswered riddle, every forbidden artifact, every detail that does not fit is a reminder that history is not complete. It is a puzzle with missing pieces deliberately locked away. So the story of Tartaria does not end with its erasure. It ends with a challenge to those who dare to look past the textbooks, who dare to question why an entire empire could be silenced. Because the truth is not destroyed, it is sealed, waiting beneath layers of doctrine and centuries of control. The gatekeepers of time may still guard it, but they cannot erase the longing to know. And perhaps one day, when enough people ask the right questions, the gates will open and the light of a forbidden empire will shine again. For history does not belong to those who hide it. It belongs to those who seek it.